It is now 10 days since terrorist group Hamas launched its attack on Israel. Thousands of people have died in the resulting conflict, with the shocking scale of Hamas's initial assault raising questions not only about the capabilities of Israeli defense systems, but about how Hamas could access the financial resources needed to carry it out. Now, in the aftermath of the Hamas attack, there was initially confusion about whether the European Union was planning to suspend development aid to Palestinians. EU officials later clarified that no humanitarian aid would be suspended, but that development aid would be reviewed. Let's take a listen to how one French politician expressed his views on the international responsibility to crack down on those providing funds to terrorist groups.
We must cut off all development aid to those involved in financing terrorism. And we must impose sanctions. We must impose sanctions. Penalties must be imposed on states like Iran and Qatar that finance terrorism.
Eric Ciotti there. Let's zone in on one of those countries he mentioned, Iran. A staunch enemy of Israel, it is known to provide funds to Hamas. According to 2020 estimates from the US State Department, Iran provides about $100 million annually to Palestinian groups, including Hamas, with one Israeli security source recently telling Reuters the figure had climbed to about $350 million in the past year. Now, to talk more about this, I'm joined by Kasra Aarabi, an Iran specialist and IRGC Research Director at United Against Nuclear Iran, a non-profit. Kasra, based on your research, to what extent and how does Iran fund Hamas?
Well, it's important to understand that the Islamic Republic of Iran, the regime in Iran, is the primary military, financial, logistical and ideological supporter of the Hamas terrorist group. And if we take a step back, I want to unpack the nature of this relationship, which really started to flourish in the early 1990s. We saw Hamas militants being sent to Lebanon to undergo training by Hezbollah, but also a contingent of militants being sent to Tehran to undergo missile training by none other than the so-called godfather of the Iranian ballistic missile program, IRGC commander Tehrani Moqaddam. Hamas officials have also been on record underscoring the fact that this sophisticated smuggling network that is underground in Gaza was the product of the late IRGC Quds Force commander Qasem Soleimani. So one of the mechanisms to get this kind of material and financial support to the terrorist organization Hamas is through these sophisticated underground networks of Israel, which Israel has tried to counter, but there is no doubt that this has Iranian fingerprints all over it.
And are these tax dollars or oil income that Iran is using to fund Hamas, how does the money actually reach them?
Sure, it's a combination of both, and I think the oil revenue is really important here. Illicit oil revenues, since the coming of the Biden administration, the White House, have surged. So we have seen the Iranians be able to export, conservative estimates put it at around 2 million barrels of oil per day. So that's really at levels pre-sanctions. So the US administration hasn't been enforcing sanctions, and the Islamic Republic has been taking advantage of that. And this is consistent, by the way, with the surge in funding that we see for Hamas, as you earlier mentioned. This year, in the past year, we have seen Iranian funding, we have seen funding via the IRGC increase from around $100 million to $350 million. You put that against the backdrop, by the way, of changes to the IRGC's doctrine, changes to the IRGC's structure, and you can get a clearer picture that clearly indicates that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, had a hand not only in giving a green light to the recent terrorist attacks, but also playing a role in strategically coordinating these attacks.
Now, Kasra, briefly, if you can, what role are cryptocurrencies playing in this movement of money?
Yeah, cryptocurrencies have played an important role. Iran is actually a crypto mining hub. So I think the crypto element is important. They have been on record. They have spent a lot of resource, the Iranians, to try and use cryptocurrency as a means to evade international sanctions. But also they use traditional forms of exchanges such as Havala banking and through a network of regime facilitators, oligarchs that are spread all over the world, including in Europe, by the way. And so far, these operations have undergone without much limelight being shone on them. I think the US and the Europeans need to come together to set up a task force to identify the Iranian regime facilitators, not least the oligarchs who are acting as these facilitators across the world, not least in Europe.
What do you know about the status of the $6 billion the US agreed to unfreeze as part of a recent prisoner deal with Iran?
So this is an important question because the US has obviously come on record and stated that it has refrozen these funds. And it's important to underscore that these funds are fungible. This money is fungible. There is no guarantee that the Islamic Republic, that the IRGC will not be able to access these funds and then transfer them for their activities across the region, which includes terrorism. And I think past US administrations, including the Obama administration, by the way, said on record that there was no guarantee that we could prevent the IRGC from accessing this money. Now, the US has been very clear in its communication, has tried to avoid directly holding Tehran accountable for the terrorist attacks on Israel. But I think the very fact that the Biden administration has refrozen this $6 billion fund, these $6 billion in assets, is indicative of the fact that the Biden administration acknowledges the Islamic Republic's role in this. So I think this clearly implicates that Tehran did have a hand. Now, the status of that money is in question. The Qataris have said that this money is still accessible to the regime in Iran. And I think there's a more important point here. The US last year in 2022 made Qatar a major non-NATO ally. All the signs indicate, the evidence is there, that the Qataris are hosting Hamas senior leadership terrorists. They are supporting the Hamas terrorist organization in a way that is not really that different to the Islamic Republic of Iran. So instead of being designated as a major non-NATO ally, I think the US should designate the Qataris as a state sponsor of terrorism alongside the Islamic Republic of Iran.
There is another aspect to this story that I want to address, though, and that is the role that charities play in funding Hamas's terrorist activities. What can you tell me about that?
This is a really important question because whenever we discuss the IRGC's militia network, which includes the Hamas terrorist organization, we often focus on the hard power assets. But underpinning this hard power asset is a soft power infrastructure that the IRGC has carefully created, with full support, by the way, of all the resources of the Islamic Republic of Iran, so full state support from the Iranian regime. And these soft power organizations, call them charities, play a key role in both recruiting, radicalizing young men for these proxy organizations and militia organizations, but also for the transfer of funds. And we saw this model really reach its sophisticated peak, if you like, after the 33-day war in Lebanon, where the IRGC Quds Force created the so-called Reconstruction Committee for Lebanon, which was headed by an IRGC Quds Force commander, Hassan Shateri, and they went into south of Lebanon to funnel money via this entity, by this charity entity, to Hezbollah, but also reconstruct civilian buildings to suit and to enable the housing of IRGC missiles. And this is what they've tried to replicate in Gaza, by the way, in 2008. They created the Reconstruction Committee for Gaza, where the goal was for the IRGC not only to funnel money via these entities to Gaza, not only to recruit and radicalize young men for Hamas, but also reconstruct civilian buildings, schools, hospitals, and housing for ordinary civilians, with the objective of housing missiles in those civilian buildings. And we're seeing this today in Gaza right now. This is what we're seeing is a product of this IRGC Quds Force strategy and plan. They've carefully created this plan as it makes it much harder for Israel to identify and strike Hamas positions. And it also makes it much harder for Israel to target these Hamas positions to minimise civilian casualties. This is all part of the IRGC strategy to use civilians to protect its missiles. And of course, this is entirely a perverse strategy, but it should not be surprising, given that the fact that the IRGC, along with Hamas, are violent Islamist extremist organisations that operate in such a way.
Given how much attention this conflict is getting, how much more difficult will it be for Hamas to access funds in the future?
Well, this goes back to targeting and imposing consequences on the chief supporters of the Hamas terrorist organisation. The West so far, when I say the West, I'm saying the US and its allies, have avoided imposing direct consequences on Tehran. They have avoided imposing consequences on Qatar, which is housing the senior leadership of Hamas. And really, until the US and its allies maintain this strategy, so to avoid imposing consequences on Tehran and Doha, this strategy of escalation will continue. The funds will still reach the hands of the Hamas terrorists. And unfortunately, this period of escalation will continue. This is completely in line with the recent structural changes and doctrinal changes to the IRGC. The IRGC, in the many months leading to this terrorist attack, was preparing for a major confrontation with Israel. All the signs were there, but unfortunately we weren't, the West wasn't paying attention. If we really want to change the IRGC's calculus and ability to send funds to the Hamas terrorist organisation, the focus should be targeting and imposing real consequences that will be felt in Tehran. So punishing the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps for what we are seeing today in Israel.
How would that punishment look in concrete terms?
Sure, there are numerous ways and numerous tools at the US's disposal, but the first tool should be a concerted push to gain all European allies and other nations in the world to prescribe the IRGC as a terrorist organisation. The IRGC is a violent Islamist extremist organisation that operates no differently to prescribed groups from Hamas to Hezbollah. It has a programme of indoctrination that calls on its members to wage jihad against Jews, Christians and Zoroastrians for, quote, having unacceptable faith. And look at the way it operates. Terrorism, militancy, hostage-taking. It should be prescribed as a terrorist organisation. This would impose maximum cost on the IRGC to ensure that both its financial assets are hurt, to prevent its ability to fund terrorist organisations like Hamas, but also to curb its ability to conduct terror operations as well as homegrown extremism and homegrown radicalisation on European soil. That's one objective that should be at the priority, a top priority for the US. Another priority for the US should be imposing consequences on Qatar, making it very, very clear that they should immediately hand over senior Hamas terrorist leadership, or else they will face consequences. That should include asset freezes in Europe, in America, etc. But also, there should be a focus on targeting IRGC assets. These should be IRGC Quds Force assets should be targeted in the region, but also the US should make it very clear that the assets inside Iran, IRGC bases, are legitimate targets until the IRGC believes that the US will not impose consequences on its operations and directly on its operations and its coordination and strategy planning in Iran. Then this process of escalation will continue. We should not tiptoe around the IRGC's plan. We need to take back control and make it very clear to the IRGC that this is completely unacceptable and there will be consequences for this terrorist attack that it had a role in coordinating and greenlighting against Israeli civilians.
Kasra Aarabi, thank you very much.
Thank you.